Hey everyone, Brian Beeler and Kevin O'Brien coming to you from the Storage Review Lab, and today we're taking a look at a pretty special drive, actually. We just recently reviewed the Seagate FireCuda 530, which is their lead high-performance M.2 NVMe SSD. Now, why is this important? Well, it's interesting, and we'll get into some of that, but up to this point, we'd really been, for the high-performance category, all in on the Samsung 980 Pro, and also to some extent the WD SN850, which also has some good performance spots, although we'll go over all of that again in this video. But now, with Seagate coming to market with a drive that's really quite compelling from the performance standpoint, we've got a three-legged race, three-horse race. Yeah, that one. Well, for best drive.
Yeah, Gen 4 stuff has always been, every drive that's, most drives that's been, they've been released, is always like the fastest Gen 4 drive. And then finally another comparable comes in the market, and that one ends up beating or excelling in certain areas.
Well, but in this case, I mean, this is even their second Gen 4 drive. So there's been a couple iterations of the early Gen 4 offerings. So to your point, though, there were a whole series of Gen 4 drives that came out first. Those would be things like the Sabrent drive, Team Group had one, a couple others. And they were fast. They were faster than the current Gen 3 products. But those have all been iterated now, or mostly have been iterated and have come out. And really the gist of what's going on here is the controller on the board itself. So this is interesting. This guy here is the heatsink that came on the Phison E18 reference board that we reviewed, I guess it's been a couple months ago or now. But what it was is the Phison board with the new E18 controller, the new Micron NAND, and better firmware to really get some great performance out of the drive. And in our review of the reference design board, which at the time you could not purchase, we were really quite favorable of what the E18 was capable of in this combination. So it was a matter of time before the vendors that use Phison controllers went back to the drawing board and came out with their drives. So what we have then with the 530 from Seagate is just that. It's an E18 controller with the Micron NAND on a board that looks visually identical to what the Phison reference design was.
And it's not just it's built the same way. It's literally on the exact same PCB with all the exact same markings, all the same trace marks, everything.
No, that's not true. One says Phison, one says Seagate.
I can use a Sharpie and write my own name on it, but that doesn't make it my own.
You can make your own Kevin SSD. I'm sure people would love to buy a Kevin SSD with all the quality control that comes with that.
Yeah, so the question might come up that, I mean, there's nothing wrong with either. It's just more of, it is kind of interesting to think maybe Seagate was the designer of that particular reference board that Phison had shared.
Or Phison make the board and Seagate said, hey, looks good to us, bro, let's roll. But to Kevin's point, it doesn't really matter how we get here. Where we are is a really good version, as we'll look at in the numbers here, of an SSD that before was only available as a reference design, or maybe from some other vendor that mass market consumers aren't comfortable with, or would prefer to wait for the Seagate version for support or availability, whatever the reason, right?
Yeah.
So let's take a look at the numbers, then we can come back with some thoughts on the design itself.
So as we get into our benchmarks, we start off with our 64K sequential read benchmark.
Well, before we do all of that, real quick, what are we looking at here just from the standpoint of colors, just to call that out? So we've got the purple line was the Phison reference board. Dark blue is FireCuda 2 terabyte. We've got the other one that we're interested in is the SN50.
And that's the red.
850 is a red line. And then we've got two lines for the 980 Pro. We initially reviewed what would be, I guess, light blue, the 1 terabyte, and came back and hit the teal 980 Pro and the 2 terabyte. So just the rest of the colors we're not going to be super worried about in this conversation, but those are the major players.
Yeah, and depending on the benchmark, it's kind of funny. You'll see some of the lines that look identical, just in a slightly different, area. But yeah, so overall, the E18 reference board, probably using a little bit different firmware, was the fastest in our 64K sequential read benchmark.
But you cannot buy the E18 reference board, so this will probably be the last reference we have to that on our charts going forward. They will be replaced more or less by the Seagate drive.
Yeah, and there are reasons why vendors might not want to use early firmware. There could be compatibility reasons. There could just be optimizations based on it was stable in one area but not stable in another, but it made for good benchmarks. But there's a lot of reasons why a vendor might go with a little more.
Yeah, and it should be noted that the FireCuda 530 does trim a little bit off the high-end performance numbers on the reference board spec sheet. But it's close though. Anyway, carry on.
Yeah. So the FireCuda got in the upper 5s, just under 6, where the E18 came in just under 7. And that aligns really closely with the SA850, and then you have the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus trailing behind it, followed by the Samsung models, and then followed by a lot of the early Gen 4 products. But overall, I mean, it's right at the front of the pack.
Yeah, I'm waiting for Sabrent to release their E18 updated version. That should be interesting to see if they bring that out.
Yeah. And then on our 64K write benchmark, again, you see the 18 drives are the fastest, both in excess of 2 gigabytes per second in write, and then trailed by the 2 Samsung capacity, the 980 Pro, and then the SA850. So, I mean, it's doing pretty well. 4K write and read, though, this is an area where it's kind of like the sleeper car that is sitting off in the background that no one really pays attention to. That's the SN850. It starts off kind of slow, but as the workload ramps up, it just takes off. So that's...
You sure you didn't chart that upside down?
Yeah, I can't do that.
Okay.
And that even upside down would look weird. But that particular drive, it's almost touching 800,000 IOPS, where everything else is just short of 600,000 IOPS.
Which is why sometimes we get into this dual mode of which drive is best. Well, no drive is best. I mean, it just depends on what you're going to do with it. And in the gaming world, even too, 4K is a lot less relevant than 64 to 128 based on who you're talking to. So you just have to decide what is important to you in your workloads.
Yeah. But overall, behind the SA850, then you have the two E18 drives, followed by the 980 Pro drives. So overall, I mean, these guys are right at the front of the pack, minus the SA850.
This is a good chart, too, to highlight where the early guys were that came out. The T4s, Sabrent, Crucial. Not that it's a knock on them. They were out months ahead of all the other drives, but you can see what that delay caused on a chart like this, where the later releasing drives were really much better.
Yeah. And one thing to note before we go to 4K random write, well, the SA850 is incredibly strong in 4K read performance. We drop down to 4K random write. It's at the back of the pack.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of Jekyll and Hyde-ness of some of these drives, where they look really great in so many spots. Then you get something like this. It's kind of sad. And
that's where a lot of firmware tweaking comes into play. A vendor might want to hit like a really cool benchmark that has like, hey, we have the fastest 4K random read. I'm not saying that's the case with WD, but you have different areas where you can tweak certain knobs and dials, and in some areas it might cause one benchmark to go really high, another benchmark to go really low. But it's that kind of the...
Well, you have no choice. You can't architect firmware to do well in every workload. It's just not possible.
No, so that's where you run a lot of tests and you're going to see certain strengths and weaknesses. Every drive has weaknesses.
But here, I mean, we see the FireCuda just laying down pretty much right on top of that reference board design.
Yeah, they both do really well. And then the 980 Pros are far trailing. I mean, you're talking about a...
Yeah, but in the absence of the E18s, they were excellent for a while.
I know. That's where if you looked at the early Gen 3 versus Gen 4 stuff, all the early Gen 4 drives looked really good. And then all of a sudden, the more mature Gen 4 products came out, and it was nothing holding the back.
And to think Gen 5 is right around the corner.
True. And then Gen 6 will be around the corner.
Well, that one's farther around the corner, but 5 is almost upon us.
But yeah, that's it for our main test. Obviously, look at our review for the full benchmarks.
Right, yeah, we've got SQL Server in there. We've got some other stuff in the full review. We'll link to it in the description, and you can check that out if you want more information on how it performed in all these other tests. Okay, so coming back to this drive, I don't even know which is which because they got mixed around. Where does this leave us with Seagate? It's a really good drive. Is it now the best drive?
I would say unless you're looking specifically for top end 4K random read performance, it is the top drive.
Okay, in aggregate.
Yeah.
All right, so there's one drive that's better in one workload, but in aggregate, this has got to be our new favorite. Now, that doesn't take away from what WD and Samsung are doing. We still really like the Samsung drive. They've got the most comprehensive software suite, so if that's important to you, drive management and reporting and all of that, Samsung still has a big usability edge. WD's got a little bit there on software, and the drive is not bad by any means. Maybe it's our third favorite in the high performance category. But Seagate runs away with it here. The only thing it comes down to then is budget. And, well, do you really need that kind of performance? Because not everybody does. So let's not go crazy on components, especially with GPUs being priced so ridiculously, even if you can find one these days.
The budget needs to include the cost for RGB lights and other aesthetic purposes.
Lights and smoke signals and maybe cool heat sinks like this if you want to keep... But that is interesting, though. Seagate does offer a heatsink version. I don't know what it looks like. I haven't seen it.
West Central offers a heatsink version with one LED.
With light. But if you are going to press these things hard in a gaming rig, you are going to want to cool it. It's a big deal with SSDs in mobile workstations or mobile gaming rigs. We've seen a lot of them being power throttled or performance throttled on purpose, so that they don't overheat and fall off your board, not literally, but disconnect mysteriously. We see that all the time in our lab, but so you may want to make sure to consider heatsink and or cooling situation for the drive if you're going to be pushing it to the edge, pushing it really hard in a gaming scenario. But back to budget, I mean, if you've got the money, this just came out, so it'll be a little bit more of a cost premium. So you just have to weigh that. You're not going to lose a whole lot to go to the 980 Pro, and you're not going to lose a lot to go to the SN850. But just from a pure benchmark perspective and performance perspective, FireCuda's got to be the pick at the moment.
Yeah.
So there you have it. There's our FireCuda take, and thanks for tuning in. We'll be back soon with another video.